Thank you very much, first of all, for accepting this interview. From Xi Jinping to Putin and Erdogan, and going even further to Benjamin Netanyahu and Viktor Orban. But what unites these political leaders in the way in which they relate to power? What does it take, for example, to go all the way from, let's say, a normal, a harmless populist, assuming that populists can be harmless, to a strongman leader?
Well, I think there are several characteristics of strongman leaders, and not all of them have all of those characteristics. But I'd say the most important is a cult of personality. The central thing that all these leaders say, and that this happens whether they're starting in an autocracy like China or like a Donald Trump in a democracy, is that they have a cult of personality which says, you need to put all your faith in me, that the country is facing terrible problems. Usually these are politicians who thrive on a sense of crisis, certainly when they're coming to power, because they need a justification for why you need a strongman figure. So everything is rotten, the country's in danger, either from external enemies or internal enemies. As a result, we can't afford to have all the kind of weaknesses and checks and balances of a democracy, because that will just slow us up, and our enemies will use that system to frustrate us. So what we need is somebody with the insight that I have and the strength that I have to do what's necessary. And Trump, in fact, says in his 2016 speech to the Republican convention, he describes all the things that he says are going wrong with America as he sees it. And then he says, I alone can fix it. And that essentially is the claim of the strongman leader. I alone can fix it. And then once you've done that, you're really not, as in a democracy, talking about institutions or even about the battles of political parties and ideas. You're talking about the instincts of the leader and giving the leader the power to do what he thinks is necessary.
In this book, it was a little surprising, let's say it for me. You used to place Putin in the middle of this series. He's not totalitarian like Xi Jinping or Lukashenko in Belarus, but he's more like the prototype of the strongman. Now, after all these months in which Putin is not only waging a war of aggression against Ukraine, but he is also consolidating his dictatorship at home, would you still put him in the middle?
No, I don't think so. I think that he's been radicalized over the years. He's become more and more extreme. I think when he comes to power, actually, in retrospect, you can see a lot of the strongman instincts really there from the beginning. For example, the war on oligarchs like Berezovsky, the instinct to take control of the media very quickly, the Chechen war. So there were brutal elements there that maybe we were overlooking initially, because we wanted to believe our own story about Russia's becoming more liberal and so on. But I think that Putin himself has become more radical and more authoritarian, driven by a lot of things. Firstly, there's an element of disillusionment with the West. He has convinced himself that the West betrayed him in Iraq, over Kosovo, over any number of issues. And the Libyan war, incidentally, is also important in that. Secondly, I think that any leader who stays in power for as long as Putin does, 20 years now, more than 20 years, is likely to become a megalomaniac. When everybody around you is scared of you, when everybody around you is saying you're right, doesn't want to contradict you, is trying to make, as somebody said to me, it's probably 20 years since he opened a door for himself. It's an exaggeration, but you know what I mean. He is in that position of a sort of czar. And so eventually you begin to behave like a czar and to think like a czar, and you lose touch. And I think that the decision to invade Ukraine was an example of a sort of massive miscalculation. Now, of course, democratic politicians can make miscalculations like that as well. I mean, arguably George Bush did it in Iraq in 2003, but I think you're more likely to do it if you're sort of cut off from the kind of cut and thrust of a democratic system, where you're at least forced to confront the difficulties in your arguments. And then I think that once he's at war in Ukraine, he is facing a national emergency, albeit one that he has created himself. and Russia is suddenly isolated, it's losing a war, and his own personal survival is clearly at stake, possibly, certainly his political career and maybe even his life. And so for both political and personal reasons, the incentive to try to even harder to crush all opposition is, goes up, and that's where we are now.
He's almost forced to become a totalitarian leader.
Yeah,
Is the only way for him.
I think psychologically he's forced to, because he has to justify this idea of national emergency, to justify this terrible situation he's created, but also, in the classic way of somebody who fears for their future, he becomes paranoid about any form of opposition. And so you see the treatment of Navalny and so on, but also much lower profile people who are imprisoned, driven out of the country, and so on.
As you show in your book, the West has long time cultivated, and it still does, populist political leaders or strongman leaders. Some of them even got the Nobel Prize for Peace, like the leader of Ethiopia. But in the same year, Donald Trump, let's say, it was also a contender for the prize. So
yeah, certainly in his own mind he was.
Yes. Why is the West incapable to get out of his trap? Because let's look at Erdogan this day. Erdogan is still acceptable for the West. At the same time, since Turkey is a key member of NATO, he even has the power to blackmail the West.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think you partly answered your own question that, we would like to be able to say, we're not going to have anything to do with these leaders. But in fact, often they run powerful countries. And sometimes if you want to combat one strongman leader, you need the other strongman leader. And so that, one of the reasons the West is tolerating Erdogan right now is because Putin is the priority. Turkey, because of its geographical position, the Black Sea and so on, is absolutely crucial. And if we were to turn around and say the truth, actually, that Erdogan is close to a dictator and that he's imprisoned a lot of his political opponents, including the leader of the Kurdish party, and as well as, Osman Kavala and various liberals and so on, and make a big issue of that, we would run the danger of driving Erdogan into Russia's hands. And if you see it as a kind of big global struggle between democratic forces, loosely defined, and authoritarian forces, then you don't want to sort of strengthen the most important authoritarian of the moment, which is Putin, by pushing Erdogan towards him. So you're constantly forced into these really unpleasant trade-offs. To give you a Romanian example, there's a considerable embarrassment in Britain that we remember when Ceausescu visited the Queen, and he was given, I think, a knighthood and all sorts of honors. And it's not, I hope, because we thought Ceausescu was a great guy, but obviously in the context of the Soviet Union, he was felt to be somebody who was worth cultivating. So it's been going on a very long time. But I think another thing that happens, particularly in the particular sort of ideological context of the end of the Cold War, is that the West became extremely confident in what Fukuyama called the end of history theory. We believed that basically all countries would have to, if they wanted to succeed, would have to become liberal democracies, and that there was no future in this kind of strongman leadership. So we tended to believe, or that the next kind of strong leader would be somebody who would lead their country towards democracy. And, I quote in the book many examples of us, people saying that about Putin, people saying it about Erdogan in 2003, people saying it about Xi Jinping in 2012. And then, as you say, in a way, the most ludicrous example was Abiy Ahmed in 2019, who is hailed as this peacemaker, given the Nobel Peace Prize, and then turns out to be a nationalist killer.
It is the same with Saudi Arabia, because President Biden visited Saudi Arabia after the Khashoggi affair.
Indeed, and Saudi Arabia is an example of both those tendencies. So first of all, you get MBS coming to power, and a lot of people, including journalists, incidentally, saying this guy's a reformer. Tom Friedman goes there and writes a couple of columns about how important he is as a reformer. And I know, because fortunately I wasn't sufficiently important to be invited to sit with MBS drinking tea, but I know several people who were, and it was quite seductive for them. They would come back and say, oh, this guy's really clever, he's got all these great ideas, and then it's very embarrassing when he commits the Khashoggi murder. So there was a classic case of the West making the mistake and thinking this guy is a liberal when he isn't. But incidentally, we've gone through this phase. So then there's a phase of repudiation after Khashoggi, and now MBS is coming back for reasons really of realpolitik, the classical reasons that, we need him against Iran. We don't want to see Saudi Arabia drawn into China's camp or Russia's camp. And also money, frankly. Saudi Arabia is unbelievably rich at the moment. The high oil prices, you can see they're buying up every football in the world, but not just every footballer. The sort of, investment banks, management consultancies, they're all back in Saudi Arabia because they want that business. And so they're prepared to sort of believe, well, maybe, that was a kind of bad incident, but overall things are going in the right direction. And you still hear that from, I've heard it from quite influential Western politicians who will say, basically, MBS, for all his flaws, is leading Saudi Arabia in the right direction. And I think I quote in the book, actually, one former British intelligence chief who said to me, my question about him is he Lee Kuan Yew, the sort of authoritarian but brilliant reformer of Singapore, or is he Saddam Hussein? And he has elements of both.
You are describing a vicious circle because realpolitik is what led us to Putin.
Yeah. I suppose there were also internal Russian, dynamics that we wouldn't have any control over necessarily, that lead, described in the book and mine and many other books, how Putin comes to power and the actual mistakes that a lot of people in the Russian elite made, who believed him to be a sort of quiet managerial figure who would just bring a bit of order to everything and protect everybody's interests, and didn't really see the authoritarian KGB core of the guy that came to the fore later. So those mistakes happened. But then, with and then there was the second mistake, the wishful thinking mistake. We wanted to believe that Russia was going to be actually a friend and join the Western order. If you remember, Russia is invited to join the G8 and is a member. The G7 becomes the G8, and I think he's only thrown out in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. So, for all the Russians saying, well, the West never gave us a chance, they didn't want to help us. Well, actually, I think the invitation to the G8 was a huge thing. So there was that, and then there was the, at various points he was important for realpolitik, although he was, if you think back, say, to the Iraq War, when Putin actually was part of the opposition to that, and there's the famous summit he has with Chirac and Schroeder to oppose the war. But sure, Russia's a big important, and again, the business interests that I mentioned in Saudi Arabia are also very important with Russia. Russia, like Saudi Arabia, is a huge supplier of energy. There are big fortunes being made. We saw these, and a lot of Russian money washes up in London, for example. So there's everybody from lawyers to estate agents to investment bankers have a direct financial interest in keeping things going with Russia.
What do you think? How did the West manage so far the situation caused by the war led by Russia against Ukraine?
Sorry,
how the West manage this situation?
How do you think we'll manage now?
Yeah,
I don't know. I think it's an uncertain moment. I think we put a lot of hope in this counteroffensive by the Ukrainians, which doesn't seem to be going very well. Now, you remember from the course of other wars that wars are very unpredictable, and they can feel like they're stalemated for a long time, and then suddenly something happens. That could be a good thing for the Ukrainians or a bad thing. Things could turn against Ukraine as well. And in a way, although we don't like the stalemate, and I think the central view now is that if the Ukrainians don't make a breakthrough, probably the pressure for peace talks will increase. And then the question is, is Russia interested in peace talks? I think we sort of assume a lot of the conversations in the West assume that, well, we'll just say at a certain point, okay, we've lost interest, and then we'll make some concessions and there'll be a peace. But what if Russia's not up for that? Putin himself, as we were saying, is very radicalized, may feel that over time he can wear Ukraine down, that the West will lose interest. He may want to go, so there's all sorts of uncertainties around that. But I think that, yeah, as I say, the sort of central scenario, which is not to say it's going to be true, is that sometime maybe early next year you'll get an effort to have a kind of, Minsk 3, Minsk 4, a kind of ceasefire in place, just to end the killing. And then at that point, Ukraine will have to accept some further territorial losses. I'm not sure they will, but that would be, I think, probably the Western view. Certainly Crimea and maybe bits of Donetsk and Luhansk that they haven't been able to reclaim. And then we'll go about the business of trying to reconstruct what remains of Ukraine, pouring money and maybe really talking seriously about them joining the EU by, I've heard 2030 mentioned as a possible date.
This scenario will freeze Ukraine for NATO, for example.
Yeah, probably. But I think that the Americans are, at the moment, are the biggest block on that. Ukraine's in a sort of paradoxical position because, they cannot survive without America's their most important supporter, no doubt about it. All the most important military aid has come from the US. There's been a lot from Europe, but the US stuff is the most important. But actually, if you look at the diplomatic positions of all the sides, America's probably the most cautious. It's like it's a bit like Germany, It's very wary of letting Ukraine into NATO, and the Americans are talking about what they have called an Israeli solution. They're now trying not to call it that because there are too many differences. But very broadly, it's saying, we will give Ukraine enormous military aid to make it to ensure that Russia will never attack it again because it'd just be too dangerous. But we won't give them that security guarantee, which would involve admitting them into NATO, because apart from else, they just don't feel that they can sell that to the American people, the risk of going to war with Russia over Ukraine.
And America has its own problem these days.
Yeah, absolutely. And who knows? I think that's the view of a relatively kind of mainstream Atlanticist American administration. But obviously, if Donald Trump came in, we've no idea what he would do. But he might cut off aid to Ukraine really quite fast, because first of all, he's an isolationist, and second, the complications to do with Hunter Biden. The Trump administration or Trump campaign now is obsessed with their claims of that Hunter Biden is corrupt, and the corruption allegedly took place in Ukraine, and they have put constant pressure on the Ukrainian government to give them evidence to support their assertions. They haven't got that evidence, and so there's really quite a bad relationship between the Trump people and the Ukrainians.
Do you think that United States and democracy in United States still have antibodies for a new Trump administration?
Yeah, well, that's a huge question. I mean, I hope we don't find out that he loses the election, and I think he probably will, but I wouldn't put too much on it. I mean, I think it's close, because every American election since 2000, with the possible exception of 2012, when Obama beat Romney fairly easily, has been very, very close. Even Biden's, although if you look at the Electoral College, he wins quite clearly, a couple of 100,000 votes in different, in either directions in key states like Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Trump could have won, even though he would have had fewer votes overall in the United States. So, yeah, I think it's certainly, any American election is going to be close, so he can win. If he does, I think he'll be even more radical, because he's now very angry about these efforts, these court cases against him, and I think he will retaliate by trying to go after his political opponents. Maybe get Biden arrested over Hunter Biden or whatever he claims. To do that, he would have to try and take over the Department of Justice, put Trump people in there, take over the FBI, sack lots of judges. I don't know whether he can get away with that. I mean, I think that it would be harder to do, do that in the United States because of the diffuse nature of power and the democratic traditions and traditions of free speech. You don't demolish those very easily. So I think rather sinisterly, a lot of Trump people have become very interested in the example of Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban has a very high profile amongst Republicans. He's been invited to speak to CPAC, which is the Conservative Political Action Committee. Tucker Carlson did a whole week of his show out of Budapest. And one of the reasons they're interested in Orban is that Orban shows how you can take a democracy and turn it into something much more autocratic by using constitutional changes, gerrymandering, packing the courts, taking over the press, so that now Hungary doesn't really have an independent judiciary or an independent media. And that would be, they wouldn't say agree that that's what's happened. In my view, that's my view of what's happened. And I think that they would be interested in a similar process of cultural change, as they would put it, in the United States. I think you could do bits of that in America, but I don't think that in a country as large, as with so many different sources of wealth and power, that you can control them all, take them all over very quickly without provoking violence. You'd have to, really have a reign of terror. You'd have to start arresting people, putting them in prison. And I think also the federal nature of the United States will help protect democracy to some extent. I think of, say I have relatives who live up in the Northeast. If you're living in Connecticut, say, Yale University or whatever, I don't think your life changes overnight the moment that Trump becomes president. You can still do the things you used to do. The papers are still free. You can speak freely in a seminar without being arrested or that kind of thing, which is not to say that what Trump would do would be negative, would be kind of negligible. I think he would do a lot of things that would make us all very worried. And I think there would be the risk of violence and maybe even people talking about, California becoming an independent state. Crazy stuff would happen. But I don't think you could go from where we are now to a kind of even a Hungarian style autocracy in 5 years.
What about Israel? Because I'm thinking that Israeli peoples thought the same, that if Netanyahu comes back, the democracy in Israel will resist. But look at Israel these days. You wrote your book before this comeback.
Israel is in trouble, but I think Israel doesn't have as many constitutional checks and balances as
doesn't have a constitution.
It doesn't have a constitution at all. It's one of its big weaknesses is that the Supreme Court was acting as the constitution, and therefore by making that one change, he can really do something. Also, the Israeli story is not over yet. I mean, in a sense, we're seeing the pushback by civil society and by the army and so on. And I don't know how it's going to play out. But Israel is a much smaller place than the United States, and therefore probably easier to get control of the levers of power, but not without problems. So we'll see. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting example. And I was, when I included Netanyahu in the book, I thought, oh, this will be controversial. A lot of people won't like it. But actually, I feel I was completely right now when you look at what's happening.
And the history confirmed you.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
That's but at the same time, you write in your book, it seems that the United States have reduced their presence and their involvement in the effort of democratization of the African countries, which left even more room for China to encourage authoritarian regime. Can the United States, a new administration, recover the lost ground?
With difficulty, I think, because as we were saying, they're very, very focused on Asia now. And America, it's whatever. It's a big country, but it's about 20%, a little more of the world economy. It's about 5% of the world's population. They are the world's dominant power, but they're finding it increasingly difficult to be the dominant power in every region of the world all the time, with the rise of China and so on. So they struggle in Africa because there are so many other demands on their time. There's the Middle East, there's China and Asia, there's Europe, Russia, Africa's a bit sort of on the side. And I think that actually one of the interesting sort of sub-struggles in Africa at the moment is not so much America, China, though that's important, but France and Russia. Where
Look at Niger, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you can see the French zone of influence really crumbling right across West Africa and the Sahel, and Russia, despite its problems at home, using the Wagner forces as something that dictators are pretty keen to have on their side, because I'm sure the French could be pretty brutal in their times, but they are essentially, they're still a military run by a democratic country, so they're not going to do things like Wagner do, and you go in and massacre a whole village without they won't do that, I hope, but and if they did, there would be a backlash in France and so on. So they can offer a kind of brutal suppression that some African leaders might quite like, particularly if they're facing an Islamist militancy that's very hard to suppress. Plus, there are all sorts of corrupt deals that Russia will do individually with leaders to share up mineral wealth, for example. And obviously, we know that Prigozhin has a huge business empire in Africa.
That's the reason for what he is still alive.
Yeah,
I presume.
And I think that it's he's become very rich, and he's probably made a lot of Africans who are prepared to work with him pretty rich as well.
So this is my last question. Next year we'll have new European elections for European Parliament. How would you assess the danger of populism and strong man leaders in this context of the war? Does democracy in the West depend, for example, on the outcome of the war in Ukraine?
No, I don't think it depends on it, because I don't, in the end, the countries of Western Europe and the United States and so on have plenty of forces pushing for democracy. But I do think if Putin were to succeed in Ukraine, it would be a big blow, because we've said, and for a while believed, that we're going to draw a line here. We're going to demonstrate that these are values that we support, and that we have power that Putin didn't reckon with. And I think many in the West, certainly when things were going well, thought, okay, we can send a message, we can do something good here, but we can also send a message around the world that those people who believed that authoritarianism, Putinism was the wave of the future, well, look, this guy's just made a terrible mistake and has failed. And I still think that is, I think it's possible actually that both the West and Russia will fail in Ukraine, in the sense that we won't defeat Putin, and we won't be happy with the outcome in Ukraine. But equally, that Russia will come out very weakened, isolated, poorer, having suffered horrible losses in the war. So both sides will come out worse. But in terms of the European elections, I do think it's interesting, that we have so far tended to say, well, the center of European politics remains liberal, democratic, internationalist, etc. And we've got a few problems, around the edges, Hungary, Poland, but they will always be outweighed by the liberal consensus in the middle. But what happens if the far right, or maybe the far left, but probably more likely the far right, begins to make gains across Europe?
In France, in Germany.
In France, exactly. You see the AfD now second in the polls. Vox actually didn't do that well in Spain, which is quite encouraging. But Meloni arguably is the far right. Some people, there's a debate now going on about, well, what does Meloni represent? Some people say, well, look at her on Ukraine. She's been pretty good. She hasn't been as irresponsible or vicious on migrants as we feared. She's okay. Others say, well, look at the people that she praises still. She's a big fan of Orban. She's appeared with Marine Le Pen, and one of the things you learn about these strongman leaders, certainly in the book, is that they can start quite moderate, but the longer they're in power, they become more radical. And so I think it's too early to breathe a sigh of relief about Meloni. And then if you have, you've got opinion polls in France now showing that if the election were a rerun, Le Pen would beat Macron. Now, fortunately, that's 4 years off. We don't know what will happen. It's a long time. But as you say, Germany, and so on.
Spain these days, because we don't know what
we don't know
exactly
what's going to happen. And so, if you have Poland Law and Justice win the next elections in Poland, and incidentally, even in Sweden, the Sweden Democrats are up to 20%. So, if nothing else, the sort of far right populists are going to be a big presence in the European Parliament. 20%, and maybe more. And then the question will be, some of my friends say, well, actually, the European Union will make their accommodation with the far right, provided they don't actually attack the EU as an institution. If they come to some sort of accommodation with it, don't say we want to destroy the EU, work within it, then the EU might become much more reflective of their views. It's a point of view. I hope we don't ever find out, frankly, and that they're kept below that level. But I think
Viktor Orban will remain isolated.
Yeah, exactly. I think so. Yeah, because I think otherwise, it's a dangerous outlook for all of us. Because apart from else, I think that these strongman leaders are quite strongly associated with war. I don't think it's a coincidence that Putin eventually goes to war. They are nationalists, and they are people who put an emphasis on strength and force. And so I think ultimately they often become a threat to peace.
Yeah, and like Viktor Orban demonstrated, all these strongman leaders have the ability to create crises only to show their power.
Yeah, absolutely. And Viktor Orban, like Putin, says that there are members of his country who are beyond their borders, who need protection, and so on.
Yes.
Romania knows well enough about that. So, yeah.
Thank you very much.